Here's an idea. Dark Souls, much like Franz Kafka, has created its own precursors. Before we get started, I just want to say that this truly is the Dark Souls of Idea Channel episodes because I am currently struggling with the difficulty of having terrible allergies, which has never happened to me before. It would be unsafe for me to take even more allergy medication, so I apologize if I'm nasal. Thank you for your patience and your kindness. Okay, let's get on with it. Durians are the Dark Souls of fruit. Tinder is the Dark Souls of dating apps. Being president is the Dark Souls of being a politician. Kylo Ren is the Darth of Souls. David Duchovny is the Dark Souls of himself. Nietzsche is the Dark Souls of philosophers. Or maybe Dark Souls is the Nietzsche of video games. Lady Gaga just is Dark Souls. Game of Thrones, of course, is the Dark Souls of TV, and Zelda, Minecraft, Mario 64, The Witness, Call of Duty, Black Ops 3, Spelunky, and Undertale are all the Dark Souls of video games. Dark Souls is arguably the most metaphorized video game. It is constantly used as a metaphor. Anything resembling the game's design or difficulty is dubbed the Dark Souls of its ilk. We're gonna talk about why, but first, for the unfamiliar, an ember to kindle the flame of knowledge. If you wanna skip this part, you can just click on this bonfire to travel to the other side of this explanation. The Dark Souls series of games is by From Software and published by Bandai Namco. Players find themselves in a crumbling world as a corpse or something corpse-like and are given impossible sounding tasks akin to murdering or becoming gods. Along the path, you're met with, here comes an understatement, some difficulty. The common quip is that Dark Souls is difficult but fair. The central aspect of this difficulty is combat, though the terrain can also be confusing. Most enemy encounters are non-trivial, and in Dark Souls you die a lot. In 2014, VentureBeat estimated that 42 Dark Souls players died every second playing Dark Souls 2. That's 23 times faster than the actual global death rate. Errant Signal describes Dark Souls difficulty as being about situational awareness and response, not twitch skills. This is tricky to nail down in brief. Extra Credits did a great video about it, but I hope it suffices to say this difficulty is polarizing, and though the game is tough, for certain players it's rarely frustrating, unless you ask them what it's about. On its face, Dark Souls is about exploring Gothic environments, swinging implements, and/or casting spells, players best horrific foes and collect their souls to level, get loot, and learn magic. That's right, the in-game economy is based on the metaphysical essence of your aggressors. Haters gonna hate, and then the essence of their being will fill my coffers. Beyond that, however, it's largely unclear what's happening unless you decode stories told in architecture, the Delphic mumblings of non-forthcoming NPCs, and the secret lives of in-game objects, a game aspect that Game Show touted as the future of video game storytelling. YouTuber VatiVidya, who has become something like the poet laureate of Dark Souls, has done lots of that and made some great DS lore videos if you want to know more. What we're gonna wager is that Dark Souls' unique tough but fair difficulty and its narrative opaqueness are what cause it to be so largely metaphorized. To put it simply, Dark Souls is genre defining, just in a weird way, in a way remarkably like Franz Kafka, actually. Now, am I about to say that Kafka is the Dark Souls of short story writers? I'm not. Famed also short story writer Jorge Luis Borges is. In 1951, in the Argentine newspaper La Nación, Borges published a short essay titled Kafka and His Precursors. In it, he describes a desire to study writers who predate, but still somehow resemble Franz Kafka, author of The Trial, The Metamorphosis, and many stories which fuse the real and surreal and deal with identity, anxiety, and mysterious powers that be. Borges considered Kafka as singular as the phoenix of rhetorical praise, but started noticing Kafka-like things all over the place, even in things written before his time. He sees Kafka in Zeno's paradox, the trouble of having to go halfway before reaching a destination, raising the question of how one ever gets the whole way. Borges compares this to The Castle, Kafka's unfinished novel about the impossible to traverse remoteness of bureaucracy. Kafka, Borges thought, could be found in the works of Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, in the poem Fears and Scruples by Robert Browning, and in other works by various authors, all in this study who came before him, who predate Kafka. Concluding, Borges writes, "If I'm not mistaken, the heterogeneous pieces I have enumerated resemble Kafka. If I'm not mistaken, not all of them resemble each other. In each of these texts, we find Kafka's idiosyncrasies to a greater or lesser degree, but if Kafka had never written a line, we would not perceive this quality. In other words, it would not exist. In other words, Kafka's literary works would, of course, inspire imitation, but once he unified and came to embody a set of characteristics, we can see imitators from before he ever set pen to paper, thus creating an unexpected relationship between authors as disparate as Zeno, Kierkegaard, and Browning. Kafka created his own precursors and gave us the Kafkaesque, which Harry Steinauer describes as a topsy-turvy world pervaded by anxiety and frustration, individual, social, and cosmic. Dark Souls then has created its own precursors and given us the Soulsian, a clutch of characteristics and audience responses that have been present in other media but not unified and embodied. The Soulsian describes perhaps a world on the brink, pervaded by difficulty and ruin, individual, societal, and spiritual. The Soulsian does have a dimension the Kafkaesque lacks. It's fundamentally visual. The series' popularity and striking visuals lead even the vaguely medieval or Gothic being dubbed Dark Souls alikes. To have colonized a visual style a millennia, give or take, its senior, is quite the accomplishment for a video game. Relatedly, like the Kafkaesque, Soulsian comparisons benefit from mystery. We've talked recently about narrative gaps, and Dark Souls has gaps on gaps. It's comparable in countless situations because of how murky its own situation is, how open it is to speculation and interpretation.
The cool thing about this game is that it permits that activity, the act of creatively reading the game, putting the pieces together into new shapes.
To call something Soulsian is to ask Dark Souls to stand against it, and like the Kafkaesque being rooted in a mysterious temperament, we can apply and arguably misapply that comparison without implicit objection by the source material. In 2014, Joe Fassler wrote about that which is incorrectly labeled Kafkaesque, and one need not travel far to encounter internet screeds 1000% done with Dark Souls comparisons. Largely though, calling things Soulsian has to do with challenge, reward, and audience affect. Ayn Rand, Mark Z. Danielowski, or Jonathan Franzen are potential dark lit Souls authors because their works are difficult, are about difficulty, and reward investment. Similarly, self-employment is the Dark Souls of having a job. Batman vs Superman is the Dark Souls of movies, and vegan recipes are the Dark Souls of cooking? These things may be challenging, polarizing, and alienating, but no less rewarding. And just as an aside, I think that Batman vs Superman was one of the more interesting movies to come out this year, even if it was, technically speaking, bad. In his piece, Dark Souls is the Dark Souls of Dark Souls of Dark Souls, Samir Farag writes, Dark Souls is a metaphor for anything you want because it represents difficulty. And we humans obsess over things we consider challenges and things we can compare to other things easily. The real reason Dark Souls can be compared so easily to life is because we fetishize difficulty, end quote. I'm picking up what he's putting down, but it's also important to talk about Farag's we. We fetishize difficulty, he writes, after we humans. Is he saying it's part of human nature to fetishize difficulty, to treat it with reverence and respect? Dark Souls itself fetishizes the result of in-game difficulty, death, or at the very least, it totemizes it. Death is often regarded with a kind of devotion. There's a reverent and sometimes ritualistic air given to the journey/sacrifice of the player character, as well as leveling up, purchasing items, and all else involving souls, a currency based in death. Death itself and symbols of its occurrence are turned into items, marks of power or significance. Boss souls can become powerful weapons. The whispers of other players, their ghosts, shadows, and messages litter the environment. Bloodstains allow you to watch them bite it again and again in prep for your own inevitable demise, which may itself become a bloodstain. So, I mean, maybe it's no surprise that playing Dark Souls 3 for the first time, seeing my first "You died" screen at the hands of Iodex Gundyr, finally felt at home. That screen was more welcoming than any bonfire. It's unfair, I think, to say people play Dark Souls because it's difficult, but nonetheless, the game does train players to love such a fate, or at least it habituates them to it, to endure, accept, move beyond, and ultimately value its demands and what it expects of them. I don't know if I agree that people fetishize difficulty, but Dark Souls fetishizes in-game death. demise becomes entertainment, information, and is linked to reward and even noble sacrifice and heroism. As my friend Max Cantor points out in a piece he wrote on Medium, Dark Souls gives you responsibility, and with responsibility comes agency. Those playing don't play to die, quite the opposite. They play to live as best they can. It's just that death is the mark that one is truly playing Dark Souls, sometimes literally.
Bearer of the dark sign, let your true strength shine.
Enjoyment of a seemingly onerous process could boil down to simple effort justification. In order to allow ourselves trysts with hardship, we must value it inordinately, but to say humans come to Dark Souls and things like it ready to value turmoil the way it asks us to feels backwards to me. It also doesn't explain the hordes of humans who pick up Dark Souls once and then immediately put it back down. Unless they're not human. Wait, is Dark Souls a kind of Turing test? Anyway, for one, there is endless difficulty in the world that is neither valued for that fact nor metaphorized to conjure it. But for another, Dark Souls works endlessly to reward and value sacrifice, both in-game, in deaths, and out of game, in time and dedication, in very particular and measured ways, many of them linked to its own obscurity. The further you progress, the more narrative fog you clear. Dark Souls' difficulty is dull without its mysterious narrative, and its narrative is just merely perplexing without its difficulty. How each drives the other within the audience experience gives rise to the Soulsian, which isn't about what a thing is or what humans are. It's about how certain things, pieces of media, make us feel. Like the Kafkaesque, we don't value the remoteness of authority or the anxiety of individuality. We value being able to identify and comport ourselves well in the face of a vague arrangement of characteristics that make something surreally bureaucratic. For the Soulsian, when the comparisons are earnest, it's not the difficulty that's valued, I don't think, but how we may strategize around and overcome that difficulty and then feel repaid for it. How we feel, in a word, praised. What do y'all think? What constitutes the Soulsian? We gave this very short description, but I'm open to suggestions. And what is its relationship to difficulty and reward? And also, just for fun, what do you think are the Dark Souls of books, literature, movies, comic books, and why? Let us know in the comments, and I will respond to some of them in next week's comment response video. Hopefully by then, I will no longer have allergies. That would be nice for everybody, but especially me. My allergies are gone. In this week's comment response video, we talk about your thoughts regarding a face swap. If you want to watch that one, you can click here or find a link in the doobly-doo. In case you missed it, there is a brand new Idea Channel Liberal Arts Unicorn t-shirt. If you want to check that out, you can click the merch link all the way in that far corner or go to dftba.com. We also have some postmodernism hats in the works. On this Friday, we're going to be releasing a short video that explains how you can both win and purchase a Pomo hat. For those of you heading to VidCon in a couple weeks, we'll see you there. We're gonna be having meetups and panels and all this other fun stuff. Once we have a full schedule of all the stuff that we're gonna be doing, we'll post links on the subreddit and on Twitter, and of course, here in the YouTubeables. We have a Facebook and IRC and a subreddit links in the doobly-doo, and the tweet of the week comes from SFB Tom, who points us towards proof that history is invented using street sharks. Need I say more? And last, but certainly not least, this week's episode would not have been possible or good without the very, very hard work of these Abyss Watchers.